So we're in our study on the church at Corinth, from carnal to Christian, and we are in chapter 9. And as I said last week, I'm not taking chapter 9 verse by verse or section by section. I'm doing 2 weeks on it, but switching the 2 weeks around, switching around verses during the 2 weeks to cover 2 different styles of subjects. I don't know where I learned the lesson or when I learned it. I can't remember. But it's one of the most important pieces of wisdom I ever heard and have ever tried to apply in my life, and that is, choose your battles wisely. Not every fight needs to be fought. I think it's such an important truth. There's some people who just fight about everything. And I'm also not saying you should fight at all. I'm not saying you should pick fights. But you ought to decide what you're willing to fight for and what you're willing to risk just about everything for, and then sort of relax on most other stuff. We have all known people who fight and argue about everything, right? We've all known people like that. They fight and argue about everything. They love to argue. They love to fight about politics and sports and the economy, and quite naturally that eventually rolls over into the church, because if you fight in every other area of your life, you want to fight over in that area as well. And what happens to those people is they become marginalized. People simply don't pay a great deal of attention to them. The fact is, if you fight about everything, no one will ever take you seriously about anything. They just attach your fighting personality to whatever your belief is that you're espousing, and they don't take you seriously. You just can't fight about everything. On the other side of the issue, consider the person who generally gets along and then suddenly they are very upset. That catches people's attention. People go, "Oh, wait a minute. This guy's not a reactionary. This gal's not a reactionary. If they're really upset about something, it must be something to be upset about." So we're immediately much more attentive to whatever it is they're talking about. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9, the Apostle Paul is explaining us the spiritual importance of picking your fights. And so in chapter 8, he talked to us about whether or not Christians should eat meat sacrificed to idols. And basically, his answer to the question was this: we have every right to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols, because we know these idols are man-made, they are nothing, they don't matter at all. But if you encounter people who object to this practice, like many of these new Christians do, then you should be willing to put your belief aside. It is not a battle worth fighting. It's better to give up your rights so you can protect the person who has the weaker conscience. In other words, it's not a battle worth fighting. Choose your battles carefully. So last week we spent most of the time in the middle part of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and we're going to go back today and start in the first 3 verses, where Paul is, and it may seem like he suddenly changed the subject, but he hasn't. He's using this as an example and a setup for continuing the same thought and theme. Am I not as free as anyone else? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? Even if others think I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. He had established that church, set it up. He had pretty well had a right to say, isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? He had single-handedly gone into that church at Corinth and set it up, and then the others that were surrounding it. You yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. This is my answer to those who question my authority. So Paul was facing some kind of criticism here in 1 Corinthians, the letter that he wrote, and then a couple of years later in 2 Corinthians. In fact, as you read both letters, it appears that Paul had a kind of a stormy relationship with the Corinthian church. He was being criticized a lot. In the first chapter, he was being compared unfavorably to other Christian personalities. Way back, over a year and a half ago, before COVID, you remember in the first chapter, he was talking about, am I Apollos? Some are saying I'm Apollos, some say I'm a Peter. He was being compared to Apollos. Well, the Bible says Apollos was an extremely smart and eloquent man. And we know Peter was. And so he was being compared to Apollos and Peter and others, and was coming out on the downside of that comparison. In 2 Corinthians, people were calling him a liar because he wasn't able to make a visit he had planned to make to the Corinthian churches. And we learn also in the book of Corinthians that Paul was considered to be weak physically and not much of a speaker. Now, it seems from what we're reading in this text that people were saying, or some critics were saying, that Paul was just in this for the money. So what happened to Paul is very common in ministry. It's in other jobs too, but it's very common in ministry. If you're in a position where you lead people, you will have people taking shots at you. You just will. I've laughed several times and said I've had 3 jobs in my adult lifetime. I was, in my early 20s, a football coach. Through all of my 20s and early 30s, I was a basketball referee, and then a preacher. Now try to pick, other than a politician, jobs that are more criticized than those 3. I don't think you'll find one. But I'm not complaining. If you're in a position where you lead people, you're going to have criticism. You have people taking shots at you. It's part of serving in a public arena. So in response to his critics, Paul gave his qualifications as an apostle. And after establishing his apostolic credentials, he goes on to say, don't we have the right to live in your homes and share your meals? Stuck. There we go. Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us as the other apostles and as the Lord's brothers do and as Peter does? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to support ourselves? What soldier has to pay his own expenses? What farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? What shepherd cares for a flock of sheep and isn't allowed to drink some of the milk? Am I expressing merely a human opinion, or does the law say the same thing? For the law of Moses says you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Was God thinking about only oxen when he said this, or was he actually speaking to us? Yeah, it was written for us, so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. Since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything than be an obstacle to the good news about Christ. So, let's just break down a little bit and make sure you caught everything he said there. Paul asked several questions that imply an obvious answer. Shouldn't I be allowed to eat and drink in your homes? Shouldn't I be allowed to get married and have a family? Shouldn't I be entitled to make a living from my work like you make a living from your work, and like the priest in the temple in the Old Testament made a living from their work? And he goes on with several contemporary illustrations of that. He says, if a person gives his life in service to his country, we expect the country to compensate the soldier and provide for that soldier's need. He said, a person who has a vineyard is certainly entitled to partake of the grapes or the wine that comes from that vineyard and make money from the sale of those grapes. Then he turned to the law. He quoted Deuteronomy chapter 25 in verse 9 and said, do not muzzle the ox that is treading the corn. The principle was simple. Whoever does the work should draw some income from the work. Paul points out God wasn't just teaching us. He said this straight out. Was God just teaching us about oxen out here in the middle of nowhere? No. He was giving us a principle of life. You should be able to gain support from the work that you do. In verses 13 and 14, he turned to the temple and said the priests were to be supported through the offerings of the people. Part of the offering at the temple was to support the priest who lived at the temple and were doing the work of God. Now you ask, why was Paul going through all of this? What's the point he's trying to make? Was he trying to get a pay raise? No, not even close. He simply was arguing that God's people should provide materially for those who take care of them and who serve them and who work among them. He says that's a given. It always was a given in the law. It's a given out in regular life. What he's really talking about here is what I introduced in the beginning. Choosing your fights well. Pick your fights well. Not every mountain is worth dying on. And he's setting all that up to come by saying, look, I have rights. I have rights to have a wife. Celibacy was not a requirement for the ministry. Did you hear me? Celibacy was not a right for the ministry, not a requirement for the ministry in the first century church, or the second century church, or the third century church, or the fourth century church. And surely you understand where I've gone with that. Paul did say, well, maybe I may be able to serve the Lord better if I'm single and I can be free to travel and be a better ambassador for Christ because I wouldn't have to worry about being a good husband and a good father. But he had the right to have a wife. He had the right to receive support from the church at Corinth. And Paul knew that there were people then, just like there are people now, who believe that ministers are only in it for the money. Yes, I'm sorry, I laughed. Because if they are, they're pretty stupid. I'll just say that. And in verse 16, he said that wasn't his motivation at all. His full motivation was to preach the gospel. I would rather put up with anything than be an obstacle to the good news about Jesus Christ. He preached because it was the job that God gave him to do. And because he thought he was carrying with him the most vital and important message the world has ever known. One of the books I read early and influenced me probably more, there's verse 16. I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. I'd rather die than lose my right to preach. And I say that to say this. One of the books that I read first in preaching, and somebody gave it to me, and it was the single most influential book about preaching I ever read. It was W.A. Criswell's Guidebook for Pastors. Criswell had been preacher of, at that time, the largest church in the United States, First Baptist Church of Dallas, for about 55 years. And it was a treasure trove of ideas and treasure trove of practical advice and stuff. And among other things, it said, if you can do something else, if you can be happy in some other pursuit or job, pursue it. But if you are truly called to preach, you will never be happy doing something else. And I think that was me. I do. I think I could have done a lot of other things, initially wanted to do a lot of other things, but I'm not sure I would have been happy doing them because of what Paul has written in this chapter. I think I have the most important message that there is to share in the whole world. I think the message that I share is one that helps people get into heaven for all eternity. What's more important than that? And so I just feel like that is what I have to do, and I wouldn't be happy doing anything else. Now, Paul didn't take what he rightfully could have expected because he believed it was better for him to not do so. If I were doing this of my own initiative, I would deserve payment. But I have no choice, for God has given me this sacred trust. What then is my pay? It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights. I never demand my rights when I preach the good news. Wow. Maybe you could think about it this way and it might help you a little more, because he was a traveling itinerant preacher, went and established churches all over the place. So maybe if you think about it this way. A physician, a good doctor, may attend to the sick in his charge for the highest motives and certainly receives payment for his services and should. However, when that physician also donates his time to the poor or to a missionary endeavor, his motivation is way beyond question. I have a friend who is the head of the odontology unit. Say it for me. Yeah, that's it. At Vanderbilt University. And every year, y'all know him, Dr. Nettle. Jimmy Nettle. And every year, he goes to Haiti and usually one or two other very poor countries and performs free surgeries for a week or two at a time. He often uses his vacation time and goes and performs free surgeries in third world countries. He believes that God has gifted him with an ability and a way to share the message of God in a unique way. And so he goes and does this. And that sort of destroys the idea that he's just in it for the money, doesn't it? So Paul gave up fighting for his rights so that he could present the gospel more effectively. He was, if you will, picking his fight. He chose to build a bridge to those who might dismiss the gospel rather than fight against those who were fighting him. And so he says in the next 4 verses, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who followed the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so that I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weaknesses. For I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yet I try to found, and this is the verse I want you to see so badly, because this is the heart and the crux of everything he's been saying in all of this. Yet I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. Now, he's been hit at from all sides. He's taken fire from all sides. And why does he do this? I'm trying to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. He's saying he had learned to pick his fights. He was not going to fight about circumcision for the Greeks. He wasn't going to do it. He was not going to fight about who's your favorite teacher. Is it Apollos? Is it Peter? Is it Paul? He was not going to do it. He was not going to fight about meat sacrificed to idols. He just wasn't going to do it. He was not going to fight about whether Christians should unite and try to overthrow Rome and overthrow Nero. Anybody ever needed to be overthrown, it was Rome and Nero. Nero may have been the most wicked, horrific ruler of all time. He wasn't going to fight over that. He wasn't going to fight over whether Caesar's taxation was fair. He wasn't going to get sidetracked into that. He was going to choose his battles carefully, choose his fights carefully, not die on every hill. Because if you die on every hill, well, you're dead pretty early on. All right? And so he was going to stand for the message of Christ and try to find common ground with everybody he can. Now, let me just tell you. Let me pull over here and park a minute and say some personal words. I've been a minister since 1975. It is harder right now. In fact, the last year and a half has been harder than any time in my life. People are fighting about everything. Fighting about everything. I made what I thought was a fairly innocuous statement about a month ago and had several people upset about it. And so the next week felt the need to sort of not retract it, explain it in my bulletin article. Fairly innocuous. I've never known a time like right now. I just haven't. It's not just people in society. It's not just people in the country. It's not just the countries that is divided. The church is divided. Politically, COVID, vaccines, masks, school, opening, closing. I could go on and on. That's just the stuff you hear about every day and that you know about. Well, when you fight all the time, when people fight all the time, it creates a fighting attitude and a fighting spirit in them. And so all of a sudden you find yourself fighting out and everything else too. Social media has done great. That's been a big addition to this. That's been a big help. Because it carries over then into social media, and somebody says something, somebody gets mad at them, and oftentimes brothers and sisters in Christ. So there has never been a harder time in my lifetime, the whole time I've been preaching now, which is 46 years. There's never been a harder time. And I get pulled from every direction to get involved in a fight. I do. So far, I have resisted doing it, but I often have to pray really hard about that. I do, because people should know and understand this. Just because I try to avoid those issues doesn't mean I don't have beliefs and feelings on those issues. I do. In fact, I have very strong political views. I have very strong personal opinions. And one of those strongest personal opinions that I have is that this is not the place to share them. See what I just said? This is not the place for me to share them. After I retire, I probably will. I probably will. But not now. I am trying to base my ministry the way Paul is describing here. I don't want to fight about everything. I only want to fight about what's really important. I'll die on the gospel hill, but I don't want to die on the political hill. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, nod at me or something. Or nod that way if you don't like what I'm saying. Trust me, people do. I mean, I'm not going to die on the political hill. I am not going to die. Well, here's an easy one. I am not going to die on the circumcision hill. I am not going to say all those of you who are not Christians have to be circumcised before you become Christians. There's taking a stance for you. I'm not going to die on the eating meat sacrificed to idols hill. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to die on the gospel hill. I'm going to die on the hill that if the government ever comes in and says, well, you can't preach this or you can't preach that, we'll have a problem. I will die on that hill. But that is not my job here. My job is as best I can to do exactly what Paul is talking about in this passage. Try to find common ground with everybody. Doing everything I can to save some. I've baptized 6 people in the last 3 weeks, and in each case, if I had become involved in their lives in ways other than with the church and the gospel, I guarantee you I wouldn't have baptized any of them. Absolutely guarantee you. And so that's my job. That's what's important to me. I'm trying to find common ground with everybody on the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. I think the church of today sometimes has lost some of its power because it has forgotten to pick its fights. And by protesting most everything, I think we have diluted our message to some degree about the most important thing. And therefore, some people aren't listening to us anymore because they have concluded that we are narrow-minded or angry or we are always protesting or we're guilty of trying. Here's the one I think that really bothers the world most if you come at it from their mindset. We're guilty of trying to make people behave and think as Christians even before they've met Christ. Even before they have obeyed Christ or made the choice. Well, if you think about it, that would offend you too. And so I'm trying to find common ground everywhere that I possibly can. Here's the question. Are you willing to be Christ's ambassador? As though he were making his appeal through you. Are you willing to find common ground? Let lesser things go for the sake of the gospel message. Are you willing to find common ground with people on their politics, on their stance on social issues, on the economy, on war? Now, notice I didn't say gender confusion. That's not a middle ground area. God created us male and female. Science supports and backs that up completely. So that's not a political subject. So there's some that, yes, I'll die on that hill. I've been way more, I'm just giving now, here I go off into opinion when I said I wasn't going to do it. I've been way more concerned during the last year about the direction that much teaching and education has gone in our country toward gender situations than I ever was with homosexuality. We've had homosexuality around since the beginning of time. The Old Testament, 4,000 years ago, addresses homosexuality. It doesn't even address gender confusion, because we have not had that around at all. This is new, an agenda that's being pushed. So, I don't see it as on the same level as the others. This is attacking the very essence of who we are and how we were created in the image of God. The very essence of that. So I see that as a fundamental issue. And that's a hill I'll die on. That is a hill I will die on. Now that may sound confusing to you, that I will not die on the homosexuality hill. But I don't see the New Testament apostles dying on that hill, and I don't see any older New Testament examples other than it being described as a sin. And a grievous one at that. But this one, the gender, that's a whole different hill. I'm not going to die on this one over here. I will preach, and I have preached on it a lot, but I'm not going to die on it. But I'll die on this one over here now. I'm going to. See, life is filled with choices. You cannot and you will not have everything you want, so you have to decide what's important. And that's where I've decided that's important. And let other stuff go. Now we race to the conclusion. Well, I should have been there a long time ago, shouldn't I? We race to the conclusion in verse 24 at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The Apostle Paul challenges the people in Corinth and us to stop playing around in the area of our discipleship. And he calls us to play to win. Don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadowboxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Now, I think it's somewhat fortuitous that we have made our way to this passage at this time while the Olympic Games are currently going on. During the time Paul was writing, the Olympic Games were very popular. They were the most popular games in the world then. The second most popular games were the Isthmian Games. And those games were held in Corinth every 2 or 3 years. So Paul is using an analogy here that every Corinthian could easily understand. You know, these Isthmian Games that you play, it was a big deal. It was the pinnacle of athletic achievement. Today, a win would get you on the cover of a box of Wheaties and get you all kinds of commercial endorsements. Probably would get you elected into some sort of Hall of Fame. It was the closest thing to being immortalized. To qualify for the games, you had to undergo a 10-month training regimen under the watchful eye of officials. And so Paul turns to this analogy for his final emphasis about winning this race that we are in. It is the pursuit of a prize. The athlete pursues a prize. So does the believer. And Paul says there are two differences. The crown of the athlete is perishable. It'll fade or wilt. The crown we seek, imperishable. And second, he says that unlike the athletic games, there is not just one winner. If we run the whole race, we'll all win. If we're faithful enough to finish the race. We don't compete against each other like they're competing against other in the Isthmian Games. We are competing against the world. And Paul says in the context of this passage, I've put a lot of people in heaven. He had by the thousands. And now I'm looking forward to my reward. Every one of us in here can understand that. We've got school teachers in here. We've got homeschool teachers in here this morning. A teacher certainly feels great joy when they see one of their students excel. We've got coaches in here this morning. A coach feels great joy when he or she has worked in the life of a kid for years and that kid gets a scholarship, a free athletic scholarship for 4 years in college. We've got doctors in here this morning. A doctor gets great joy from taking pain from the life of a person and making them productive again. Turning them from pain to productivity. We've got some people in here who have gardens and one or two who are farmers. A farmer draws satisfaction from harvesting a good crop. Now take all these temporal joys that I've just mentioned, and I could keep going, but I'm going to stop for the sake of time, and multiply them by the powers of 10, and perhaps you have some idea what Paul is talking about in this text when he says, man, I'm taking all these people to heaven. And imagine the joy he is feeling there. The most ultimate reward and prize and blessing that any of us will ever hear will be the Lord saying to us, well done, thou good and faithful servant. A child playing ball, every time, will search the stands to see if their parents are there. That's why I told the elders here when I first came here, my children were young, I said, now listen, if you ever ask me to choose between my family and the church, I've already made that choice. I made that choice years ago. It's going to be my family. My family's going to be with me all my life. You may not be with me all my life. Yeah, that turned out right, didn't it? But my family's going to be with me all my life. And so if you ever have me make a choice, and I said, if my kids have a ball game, I'm going to be there. If we have a meeting, you can meet without me. If my kids have a ball game, I'm going to be there. Kid is looking for their parents every time. Why? Because they desire the approval of the people who are most significant to them. When someone we love says, good job, or I'm proud of you, it's a very significant moment. So, how much more significant will it be when we get this prize that he talked about in these last 4 verses of our chapter, and we stand before our precious Lord and Redeemer and hear him say, you served me well. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. That's the prize we're trying to obtain.